The louder they called you the problem, the clearer it became that you were their solution they could never control. My dear chosen ones, let that sink in. For years they paraded their lies as truth, spinning stories where you were always cast as the villain, the unstable one, the obstacle standing in their way. And yet here we are, those same voices cracking, those same tongues tied in knots, because reality has forced its way through their illusions. The truth is standing in front of them like a mirror they can't escape. And that truth is simple. You were never the problem. They just couldn't control you. Think about it. History whispers the same lesson again and again. Empires don't fall because people scream louder than the rulers. Dictators don't crumble because rebels wave flags. Systems built on control collapse because somewhere, quietly, someone refuses to bow. Not with fanfare, not with riots, but with the audacity to live free. One spark of freedom shatters 1,000 chains. And chosen ones, that's the exact spark you carry within you. They tried to frame your independence as chaos, your boundaries as defiance, your authenticity as arrogance. But underneath their noise was fear, the raw fear of losing control. You see, their entire identity depended on your submission. As long as you played along, they could puff their chest, spin their narratives, and convince the world that they were powerful. But the moment you drew a line, the moment you said no without apology, their empire of control shook. And instead of admitting their weakness, they tried to convince everyone else that you were the unstable one. And chosen ones, before we dive deeper, if this message is already striking a chord with you, take a second to support what we're building here. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, not just as a gesture, but as fuel. Your support is what allows us to keep pouring energy, time, and effort into bringing you content that inspires, uplifts, and awakens. Every click, every share, every subscription keeps this movement alive and pushes these truths further into the world. Here's the irony. Psychologists call it reactance, the natural human instinct to resist when freedom is restricted. That's why a toddler will suddenly fight for the toy they ignored all day the moment someone snatches it away. And yet, look around. Aren't there adults who behave exactly the same? Only instead of a toy, they lusted after control of your mind, your choices, your spirit. And when you refused to hand it over, when you dared to exist outside their grip, they spiraled into tantrums worthy of aisle 3 in the supermarket. The beauty of this moment, chosen ones, is that people are finally seeing it. The fog is lifting, the chaos, the drama, the tension. It was never born from you being difficult. It was born from them being addicted to control. Now, stripped of excuses, their storylines collapse like a house of cards in the wind. Every rumor they spread, every accusation they hurled, every whisper designed to tarnish your name, all of it is unraveling under the weight of one undeniable truth. You weren't the villain. You were the proof. Proof that their power was an illusion. Proof that their authority only stretched as far as your submission allowed it. Doesn't it sting them now? The same mouths that once spat venom are stuttering, choking on the very lies they built. They wanted the world to see you as fragile, broken, incomplete. But the more they tried to silence you, the louder your authenticity echoed. The more they tried to shrink you, the taller you stood without saying a word. That is the part they never prepared for. That their game wouldn't end with your destruction, but with their exposure. Chosen ones, you are walking metaphors they can't explain away. You are the free bird they tried to cage, only to discover that cages cannot hold songs meant to travel the sky. You are the wildfire they tried to smother, only to realize that a single spark can reignite a forest. You are the mirror they can't shatter, because every time they look your way, they see the cracks in their own mask. And maybe you've asked yourself, why me? Why did they target me so fiercely? Why did they fight so hard to break me? The answer is simple but profound. Because you were proof that their power was fragile. Because your existence outside their rules exposed that their throne wasn't built on strength, but on your compliance. They couldn't risk letting the world see that someone could live freely, boldly, and unapologetically outside their grip. You weren't just another person to them. You were their greatest threat. So yes, they called you names. Yes, they painted you as the problem. But chosen ones, you need to understand this. Their slander wasn't evidence of your weakness. It was evidence of their desperation. You became the scapegoat, the distraction, the shield they hid behind so no one would notice their flaws. But here's the twist. They underestimated your silence, your strength, your refusal to perform. And now that you've stopped playing their game, the spotlight is shining exactly where it always belonged, on them. This is why the suspense is delicious. Because the ending they scripted for you, collapse, defeat, submission, has been rewritten in real time. And the new script doesn't glorify their power. It exposes their insecurity, it reveals their smallness, and most of all, it elevates your freedom. So to you, my dear chosen ones, take this moment as motivation. Let their unraveling remind you that freedom terrifies those who cannot stand without control. Let their exposure remind you that truth doesn't need defending. It reveals itself when the lies run out of breath. You weren't the problem. You were the living proof that their chains never worked. And now they finally see it. And chosen ones, before we press forward, let me pause to thank you, not just for watching, but for standing strong in your own truth. They're finally seeing you weren't the problem. They just couldn't control you, and that's exactly why this message matters. If you feel that fire, show it. Hit like, smash subscribe, and drop a 77 in the comments if you know deep down this is your story too. Every bit of your support keeps this movement alive, fueling us to bring you more raw, unfiltered truths that ordinary minds can't handle. And now, let's dive step by step into why their collapse was never about your weakness, but always about your power. Number 1. Boundaries they branded as betrayal. They didn't hate your no because it was harsh. They hated it because it proved their power over you was never real. My dear chosen ones, let me speak this plainly. The moment you drew a line, the moment you said enough, they saw you not as a person protecting peace, but as an enemy starting a war. Isn't that wild? Boundaries, which are nothing more than walls protecting your sanity, your energy, your identity, suddenly became rebellion in their eyes. They weren't upset that you set limits. They were panicked because those limits exposed that their authority only stretched as far as you allowed. Let's be real. Control addicts don't understand the language of boundaries. To them, respect has always been a one-way street. They take it, you give it. They've lived entire lives in survival mode, manipulating, demanding, and pushing people into submission. So when you stood firm, when you refused to bend or shrink just to keep them comfortable, you disrupted their entire operating system. Like pulling the plug on a machine, your boundaries left them short-circuiting. Think about it. Isn't it funny how everything was fine until you started saying no? They loved you when you played the role they wrote for you. They praised you when you kept quiet, obeyed, and adjusted to their moods. But the moment you shifted, when you stopped pouring yourself out for their comfort, the labels started flying. Suddenly you were difficult, ungrateful, disrespectful. Not because you changed who you were, but because you changed what they had access to. Here's the truth they will never admit. It wasn't your behavior that changed. It was their control. That's what made them unravel. Deep down, they knew you weren't trying to embarrass them or pick a fight. You weren't staging a rebellion. You were exhausted. Exhausted from shrinking so someone else could feel big. Exhausted from giving energy to people who drained it without appreciation. exhausted from being told who you were, what to think, how to move. That exhaustion birthed boundaries, and those boundaries made you unmanageable in their eyes. And chosen ones, let me make it even clearer. The reason they confused boundaries with betrayal is because they never wanted a relationship with you. They wanted ownership of you. They didn't want to love you. They wanted to control you. And once that control slipped through their fingers, there was no real connection left to stand on. Ask yourself, how many times did they call you the problem only after you stopped being their puppet? How many times did they act like victims when you finally demanded respect? Isn't it ironic that the peace they accused you of destroying was never peace at all? It was silence bought with your submission. The moment you stopped performing, their so-called harmony turned to chaos. That's not because you were wrong. That's because their illusion cracked wide open. Picture this, a house of cards stacked high, looking impressive but fragile. Your boundaries weren't a storm tearing it down. They were simply the breeze of truth brushing against it. And that was enough to send the whole structure tumbling. Because let's face it, real strength doesn't collapse when someone stands tall beside it. Only fragile egos crumble at the sound of a firm no. What they never prepared for was this: boundaries are not rebellion. They are self-respect in action. They are declarations that your time, your energy, your mental space are valuable. And isn't it ironic, chosen ones, that those who screamed the loudest about respect were always the ones who couldn't handle giving it back? To them, respect only existed if it came packaged with your obedience. The moment you said no without apology, it felt like an act of war, not because you attacked them, but because you dismantled their illusion of power. And let me ask you this, why do people who claim to care for you fear your growth so much? Why do they label your independence as arrogance? Why do they see your boundaries as betrayal? Because they never wanted love that required effort. They wanted control that required your silence. Here's the irony. They mistook your boundaries for rebellion, but what you were really doing was preserving your freedom. You weren't rejecting respect, you were rejecting chains. And that is the very reason they can't stand you now. Because your existence proves something they never wanted the world to see, that their dominance was always an illusion, and their authority had no weight without your compliance. So, my dear chosen ones, understand this: the moment you stopped letting them define you, you forced them to face themselves. And what they saw wasn't strength. It was emptiness. Their anger, their accusations, their tantrums, none of it was about you. It was grief. Grief for the illusion they once controlled. Grief for the mask you shattered. Grief for the truth they can't hide anymore. They confused your strength with defiance. They confused your boundaries with betrayal. But in reality, all you did was stand tall in your own truth. And that, chosen ones, is not rebellion. That is freedom. And freedom, once tasted, cannot be controlled. Number 2. When control masqueraded as care. They never loved you. They loved the feeling of power they got when you bowed your head. My dear chosen ones, let's tear the mask off this one. For too long, they convinced you that what they offered was love. Smiles that faded the moment you resisted. Affection that showed up only when you obeyed. Warmth that froze solid the moment you stepped outside their script. That was never love. That was a transaction. Control was their currency, and you were expected to pay the price with your freedom. You see, real love has no price tag. Real love does not punish independence. Real love does not demand silence just so it can feel secure. But what they gave you wasn't real. It was a leash dressed up as kindness, a leash disguised as concern, a leash wrapped in the language of protection, guidance, or what's best for you. And here's the sting. It was never about you. It was always about their need to dictate, to dominate, to control. Have you ever asked yourself why you felt so drained around them? Why walking into the same room as them made your chest tighten like you had to prepare for battle? It wasn't because you were too sensitive. It wasn't because you were hard to please. It was because you were paying for connection with the most priceless thing you own, your freedom. Every smile they handed you came with fine print. Stay in line. Every kind word had conditions attached. Don't outgrow me. Every embrace hid an unspoken demand. Remember who holds the leash. And chosen ones, isn't it telling how quickly the mask slipped once you stopped complying? The moment you thought for yourself, suddenly you were labeled ungrateful. The moment you set boundaries, suddenly you were stubborn. The moment you refused to shrink, suddenly you were rebellious. They flipped the script not because you had wronged them, but because they had lost their grip on you. It wasn't betrayal, it was exposure. The truth is simple. They weren't trying to guide you, they were trying to own you. Their care only extended as far as their control could reach. And when it no longer reached, when you dared to step beyond it, the care evaporated overnight. That's why you found yourself walking on eggshells, weighing every word, second-guessing every move. Not because you were wrong, but because their so-called love was always fragile. It was never love at all. It was control with a pretty bow. And here's where the beauty lies. The mask is slipping, not just for you, but for everyone watching. People are beginning to see the truth. They're realizing that what once looked like care was manipulation. That what once looked like concern was domination. That the warmth you were sold was conditional, cold the moment you stopped paying with your submission. The very control they clung to so tightly is now exposing them. Chosen ones, let this ignite something in you, because their downfall was inevitable. Control can imitate love for a while, but it can never replace it. Control can create compliance, but it can never create connection. And that's why they lost. Because the world is finally seeing it. They didn't lose you because you were unlovable. They lost you because they never knew how to love without control. So the next time someone tries to tell you that you're too much for expecting unconditional love, remember this: the only ones who think your freedom is a threat are the ones who never intended to love you in the first place. You weren't the problem, you were the proof. Proof that love without control exists, and proof that their grip was never as strong as they wanted everyone to believe. And that's why today, my dear chosen ones, the story is shifting. No more pretending, no more hiding. They're finally seeing you weren't the problem, they just couldn't control you. Number 3. The day you shattered their manufactured mirror. The day your refusal shattered their mirror. They needed you to reflect their greatness. But when you stopped being their mirror, the cracks showed who they really were. My dear chosen ones, let's talk about one of the most powerful shifts you ever made. The moment you refused to keep being the reflection they depended on. They didn't just want control over your choices. They wanted control over your image, because through you, they projected a version of themselves they could parade around. To the world, you were meant to be their evidence, obedient, predictable, neatly aligned with the story they told about who they were. But the day you stopped playing that role, the mirror they had built out of your life shattered, and in the shards, their true face was revealed. And that, chosen ones, is why their anger cut so deep. It wasn't just about losing grip on you, it was about exposure. Without your compliance, without your silence, the reputation they had carefully manufactured began to wobble like a stage set built of cardboard. They weren't scared of your rebellion. They were scared that without you performing the script, people would finally see that their authority was hollow. Think of it like this. They built a stage where they were the star, and you were cast as the supporting role that validated their greatness. You weren't supposed to outshine them. You weren't supposed to rewrite the lines. You were supposed to smile, nod, and keep the illusion alive. But when you stopped acting, when you started painting your own canvas with your own colors, the performance collapsed. Suddenly, their story lost credibility because the prop they relied on, you, decided you would no longer be used. And chosen ones, you know this truth already. People who thrive on appearances cannot survive exposure. They'll fight harder, lie louder, and blame you with even more intensity. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because their entire identity depends on the illusion. The real threat was never your independence. It was that your independence revealed them. Here's the irony they'll never admit. They accused you of destroying the peace, but all you ever destroyed was their illusion. They claimed you were breaking the unity, when in reality you were breaking the mask they wore. They built their identity on borrowed reflections, and when you shattered the mirror, they had to face the hollowness behind it. That's the pain they can't escape. Looking at themselves without your image to shield them. And maybe you've asked yourself, why couldn't they just let me be me? Why did my refusal to bend threaten them so much? The answer is simple, because they couldn't risk you showing the world that their so-called authority was never real. They couldn't handle people questioning their credibility. They couldn't stomach being seen without the polish your compliance gave them. To them, you weren't just a person. You were their mask, their proof, their camouflage. And when you took that away, their reflection cracked beyond repair. But here's where your power shines brightest. Chosen ones. You never needed them to validate your truth. You never needed their approval to stand tall. The moment you chose authenticity over compliance, you revealed something profound, that their power was never as strong as they wanted everyone to believe. They mistook your resistance for rebellion because they couldn't admit what it really was, revelation. You weren't attacking them, you were stripping away the mask. And now, as the dust settles, as people start looking closer, the truth is undeniable. You were never the problem, you were the proof that their power was built on illusion. The proof that without your obedience, their image had no foundation. The proof that your authenticity carries a weight that no performance could ever match. So remember this, my chosen ones, their rage, their lies, their smear campaigns, none of it was about you being wrong. It was about them losing their reflection. They can fight the exposure. They can try to glue the pieces of the mirror back together, but once it's shattered, and the world can see through the cracks. You didn't just walk away from their control, you walked away from their illusion, and in doing so, you revealed the truth for everyone to witness. And that is why today, they're finally seeing you weren't the problem, they just couldn't control you. Number 4. Your presence exposed their hollow crown. You didn't shrink them by force. They shrank themselves the moment your truth walked into the room. My dear chosen ones, let me tell you a secret the enemy will never say out loud. They weren't furious because you were wrong. They were furious because you made them feel small without even trying. That's the wound they hide, the bruise they cover, the shadow they can't shake. Your existence, your authenticity, your refusal to play a part in their script ripped the mask off their carefully staged performance. You didn't need to shout, argue, or prove anything. Simply standing there, rooted in truth, was enough to dismantle the illusion they had spent years constructing. It rattled them because their power was never real power. It was posture, it was smoke and mirrors. It was a crown carved from cardboard and spray-painted gold, fragile enough to fall apart at the first touch of authenticity. And chosen ones, your presence was that touch. You carried a weight, a depth that their surface-level ego could never replicate. Standing next to you was like standing next to a mirror they couldn't control. Suddenly, every flaw, every insecurity, every weakness they had buried under arrogance and performance reflected right back at them. Think about it. You didn't have to expose them with words. You didn't need to drag their name, reveal their secrets, or tear down their reputation. No, you were far more dangerous. You exposed them simply by existing, by being real, raw, and unapologetic. You revealed the hollowness in their power, and that, chosen ones, is why they scrambled so desperately to silence you. If they could mute your voice, maybe they wouldn't hear the echo of their own emptiness. If they could twist your reputation, maybe the world wouldn't notice the cracks in their mask. If they could diminish your presence, maybe they could survive the collapse of the image they built on shaky ground. It wasn't about keeping peace. It wasn't about demanding respect. It was about survival. The survival of a false identity that couldn't stand in the light of truth. Here's the twist they never saw coming. The more they tried to silence you, the louder your truth became. Because authenticity doesn't need a microphone, it doesn't beg for recognition. It carries its own frequency, unshakable, undeniable, impossible to bury. Even in your quietest seasons, when you spoke few words, your presence spoke volumes. People could feel the difference between borrowed power and real depth. They could sense who was genuine and who was performing. That's why they lost control of the narrative. Not because you fought harder, not because you exposed them publicly, but because authenticity doesn't need to fight. It just exists. And in its existence, it exposes everything false. The chosen ones don't battle for recognition, they simply embody it, and that embodiment dismantles facades with ease. Ask yourself, chosen ones, why do you think they reacted with such rage, such venom, such desperate attempts to discredit you? Was it really about something you did? Or was it because your presence forced them to face the one enemy they could never defeat, the emptiness inside themselves? That's the truth they'll never admit. You weren't the storm that tore their world apart. You were the mirror that showed their world was already cracked. It's easier for them to blame you than to face themselves. It's easier to paint you as difficult, rebellious, or toxic than to confront the reality that their authority has no weight, and so, in their minds, destroying you felt less painful than confronting their own hollow crown. But here's the irony. Every attempt to break you only amplified you. Every smear campaign, every twisted rumor, every desperate act to silence your presence became proof of how deeply you threatened their illusions. You see, chosen ones, they weren't angry at you. They were angry at the smallness they felt when you walked into the room. They weren't battling you. They were battling the reflection you forced them to see. And that battle, no matter how hard they tried, was a war they could never win. Because truth doesn't flinch, authenticity doesn't collapse, and presence, your presence, cannot be erased. So stand tall in this reality. You weren't the problem. You were the exposure. You weren't their downfall. You were the proof of their fragility. And now the world is finally seeing it too. Number 5. They demanded loyalty, you chose truth. They demanded loyalty to their ego, but you chose loyalty to truth. The greatest betrayal to a fragile ego is refusing to lie for its survival. Chosen ones, let me break it down for you. What shattered them was never your silence, never your boundaries, never your refusal to bend to their games. It was your unshakable loyalty to truth. They wanted something far more dangerous than obedience. They wanted your allegiance to their ego. They expected you to kneel at the altar of their pride, to surrender your reality so their illusion could stay intact. And when you refused, when you stayed loyal to honesty, integrity, and your own voice, you became their worst nightmare. Understand this clearly. You weren't defying them just to be difficult. You were protecting the one thing that can never be bought, truth. And truth, chosen ones, doesn't need permission. It doesn't bend for convenience. It doesn't stay silent just because someone in the room might get uncomfortable. That's what drove them mad. You didn't break any rules of respect. You broke the invisible contract they created, the one where your loyalty belonged not to reality but to their ego. And ask yourself this: why does honesty offend the insecure so much? Why does integrity feel like an attack to people who thrive on performance? Because every time you spoke authentically, every time you acted in alignment with your principles, you tore a hole in the story they told themselves and everyone around them. Your presence became a living contradiction to their lies. And the more you stayed rooted in your truth, the more obvious it became that their so-called authority was fragile, conditional, and entirely dependent on your compliance. Chosen ones, that's why your refusal hit them harder than a scream ever could. They weren't losing you, they were losing control over their image. Without your cooperation, their carefully crafted reputation began to crumble. Without your submission, their narrative fell apart. That's why your strength was misinterpreted as defiance. They mistook your loyalty to truth as betrayal to them, but in reality, the only thing you betrayed were the chains they tried to place on your mind and spirit. Picture this: they built a castle out of glass. Every manipulation, every demand, every false smile was a pain keeping the illusion together. And then you came along, carrying nothing but truth in your hands. You didn't need to throw stones. Your very presence was enough to reveal the cracks. That's why they panicked. That's why they lashed out. Because once people start seeing the truth, no performance can survive. And here's the irony that burns them the most. They actually believed loyalty could be bought with fear. They thought if they intimidated you enough, manipulated you enough, guilt-tripped you enough, you would fall in line. But they underestimated you. You weren't built to bow to insecurity. You weren't designed to water down your principles for someone else's pride. They had never met someone who chose honesty over approval, integrity over comfort, truth over ego. Until you. Chosen ones, never forget. They didn't lose control because you disobeyed. They lost control because you exposed how fragile that control really was. They weren't angry at rebellion. They were terrified of revelation. You showed them that authority without respect is hollow. You proved that power built on lies collapses the moment truth walks into the room. So no, you weren't betraying them. You were liberating yourself. You were breaking ties with illusions that demanded your silence and your compliance. And in that liberation, you didn't just free yourself, you exposed them. To everyone watching, it became clear the problem was never you. The problem was their pride. And that's why today, their story doesn't hold weight anymore. Because people see the difference between someone who demands loyalty for their ego and someone who lives in loyalty to truth. And you, chosen ones, are the living proof that truth always outlasts performance. You were never the problem. You were simply too real to be controlled. Number 6. Independence that felt like insult to their ego. They demanded loyalty to their ego, but you chose loyalty to truth. The greatest betrayal to a fragile ego is refusing to lie for its survival. Chosen ones, let me break it down for you. What shattered them was never your silence, never your boundaries, never your refusal to bend to their games. It was your unshakable loyalty to truth. They wanted something far more dangerous than obedience. They wanted your allegiance to their ego. They expected you to kneel at the altar of their pride, to surrender your reality so their illusion could stay intact. And when you refused, when you stayed loyal to honesty, integrity, and your own voice, you became their worst nightmare. Understand this clearly. You weren't defying them just to be difficult. You were protecting the one thing that can never be bought, truth. And truth chosen ones, doesn't need permission. It doesn't bend for convenience. It doesn't stay silent just because someone in the room might get uncomfortable. That's what drove them mad. You didn't break any rules of respect. You broke the invisible contract they created, the one where your loyalty belonged not to reality, but to their ego. And ask yourself this: why does honesty offend the insecure so much? Why does integrity feel like an attack to people who thrive on performance? Because every time you spoke authentically, every time you acted in alignment with your principles, you tore a hole in the story they told themselves and everyone around them. Your presence became a living contradiction to their lies, and the more you stayed rooted in your truth, the more obvious it became that their so-called authority was fragile, conditional, and entirely dependent on your compliance. Chosen ones, that's why your refusal hit them harder than a scream ever could. They weren't losing you. They were losing control over their image. Without your cooperation, their carefully crafted reputation began to crumble. Without your submission, their narrative fell apart. That's why your strength was misinterpreted as defiance. They mistook your loyalty to truth as betrayal to them. But in reality, the only thing you betrayed were the chains they tried to place on your mind and spirit. Picture this. They built a castle out of glass. Every manipulation, every demand, every false smile was a pain keeping the illusion together. And then you came along, carrying nothing but truth in your hands. You didn't need to throw stones. Your very presence was enough to reveal the cracks. That's why they panicked. That's why they lashed out. Because once people start seeing the truth, no performance can survive. And here's the irony that burns them the most. They actually believed loyalty could be bought with fear. They thought if they intimidated you enough, manipulated you enough, guilt-tripped you enough, you would fall in line. But they underestimated you. You weren't built to bow to insecurity. You weren't designed to water down your principles for someone else's pride. They had never met someone who chose honesty over approval, integrity over comfort, truth over ego, until you. Chosen ones never forget. They didn't lose control because you disobeyed. They lost control because you exposed how fragile that control really was. They weren't angry at rebellion. They were terrified of revelation. You showed them that authority without respect is hollow. You proved that power built on lies collapses the moment truth walks into the room. So no, you weren't betraying them. You were liberating yourself. You were breaking ties with illusions that demanded your silence and your compliance. And in that liberation, you didn't just free yourself, you exposed them. To everyone watching, it became clear the problem was never you. The problem was their pride. And that's why today their story doesn't hold weight anymore, because people see the difference between someone who demands loyalty for their ego and someone who lives in loyalty to truth. And you, chosen ones, are the living proof that truth always outlasts performance. You were never the problem. You were simply too real to be controlled. Number 7. How they cast you as the convenient scapegoat. They didn't fear your flaws. They feared what would happen when their flaws could no longer be hidden behind your shadow. My dear chosen ones, let's call this what it is. You were never their problem. You were their shield, their camouflage, their convenient excuse. They needed someone to point fingers at, someone to load their guilt onto, someone to carry the weight of the very mistakes they were too weak to face. And who better than the one they secretly knew had the strength to endure it? That's right, you. Here's the bitter truth. They weren't angry because you failed them. They were relieved as long as you were willing to play the role of the villain. Every time they lied, you became the distraction. Every time they betrayed, you became the headline. Every time they couldn't carry the responsibility for their own actions, they made sure it landed on your shoulders. That's why they needed you to stay silent, compliant, and trapped in that box they built for you. As long as you wore the label of troublemaker, their reputation stayed clean. But then you did the one thing they never thought you'd dare. You stepped out of the role. You stopped defending yourself against false accusations. You stopped performing in their script. And in that moment, chosen ones, everything unraveled. Because the moment you refused to carry their baggage, the cracks in their character became impossible to hide. Suddenly, the spotlight wasn't on your supposed faults. It was on their insecurities, their manipulations, their inability to take accountability. Think about how terrified they became. Without you as the lightning rod, every eye started to notice the truth. People could see their stories didn't line up. People could sense the drama always seemed to circle around them, not you. And the irony is delicious. The very image they were trying to protect was destroyed by their desperation to paint you as the villain. Chosen ones, here's the part they'll never admit. This was never about you being wrong. It was about their fear of accountability. Admitting mistakes would mean exposing weakness. Facing flaws would mean giving up control. So instead, they handed you their shame and convinced the world it belonged to you. And you, for a time, may have carried it, not because you were guilty, but because you had compassion, because you wanted peace, because you thought absorbing the hit was easier than endless conflict. But when you finally chose yourself, when you refused to play their scapegoat any longer, you stripped them of their safety net. And that exposure cut deeper than any wound, because now the world could see them clearly. The smoke screens dissolved. The distractions failed. Their flaws, insecurities and failures were laid bare for everyone to witness. And doesn't that explain why their reaction is always so dramatic, so out of proportion? Their rage was never about your actions. It was about their terror of being seen without the camouflage you once provided. They weren't losing you, they were losing the illusion that kept them untouchable. The power of your choice, chosen ones, is this. By refusing to play their game, you became the revelation. You proved their narrative was a lie. You proved their dominance was just projection. You proved that the dysfunction had always been theirs, not yours. And no matter how loud they shouted, no matter how many names they called you, no matter how many rumors they spread, the foundation beneath them crumbled the moment you stepped out of the role they forced on you. And now look at them. Desperate, exposed, scrambling for another scapegoat, another distraction, another shield to hide behind. But it won't work, because once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. Once the chosen ones refuse to carry the weight of other people's lies, the entire story collapses. So stand tall. Remember this, you were never the villain. You were the proof. The living evidence that their power was always borrowed, their reputation always hollow, and their authority always propped up by your silence. The moment you chose yourself, their mask fell off. And now, whether they admit it or not, the world is finally seeing the truth. They couldn't control you, and that's why they needed you to be their scapegoat. Number 8. Silence that spoke louder than any defense. Silence that shattered their script. They mistook your quiet for defeat, but it was the loudest rejection of their control they'd ever faced. My dear chosen ones, let's put it plainly. Silence was never your weakness. It was your weapon, and it cut deeper than any argument you could have thrown back at them. You see, they were addicted to the sound of your defense, the way your words gave their accusations life, the way your reactions gave their lies oxygen. They counted on it. They thrived on it. Every time you explained yourself, justified yourself, or tried to prove yourself, you were unknowingly fueling the very performance they had scripted for you. But the day you stopped, the day you fell silent, was the day their entire production collapsed. Think of it like this. Their story only worked if you played the role they assigned you. They cast themselves as the hero, the martyr, the misunderstood genius. and you were supposed to be the villain, the unstable one, the problem, and as long as you kept engaging, you were trapped in their theater, reciting lines you never auditioned for. But chosen ones, the moment you refused to perform, the curtain dropped. The audience started seeing the cracks. Their grand show suddenly looked like what it always was, a desperate act with no script left to hide behind. And isn't it wild how quickly the narrative shifts when you take away the fuel? Without your responses, their accusations sounded hollow. Without your defense, their drama lost momentum. Without your participation, their threats had no weight. It's like watching a fire die out when the oxygen disappears. Your silence was that suffocation. It revealed that their so-called authority was nothing but noise, and without you feeding it, there was nothing left to sustain. Of course, they hated it. Silence terrified them more than your anger ever did. Anger they could spin, arguments they could twist, emotions they could parade as proof that you were unstable or unreasonable. But silence exposed them. Because silence forced everyone around to see the truth for themselves. Silence made their lies echo without resistance until the hollowness rang loud enough for all to hear. And here's what makes it even more powerful. Your silence wasn't just the absence of words, it was a declaration. It was you saying, "I am no longer available for this performance. I am no longer playing a role that was never mine to play." That kind of refusal is devastating to someone addicted to control, because they realized in real time that their grip on you only existed because you allowed the game to go on. Once you stopped playing, their script turned into ashes. Chosen ones, I know sometimes silence feels uncomfortable. Maybe you've asked yourself, should I have said more? Should I have fought harder to clear my name? But understand this, silence was the louder truth. You didn't need to fight because your very refusal to fight revealed everything. When you no longer tried to convince them, when you no longer jumped to defend yourself, the power imbalance they relied on shattered. Silence became proof that you weren't controlled anymore, and look at how the world responds. People begin to notice. They see the difference between someone living free and someone still clinging to control. They feel the contrast between your calm refusal and their chaotic noise. That's why your silence was so unbearable for them. It highlighted their desperation in ways words never could. Here's the real twist. They thought silencing you would protect them, but instead, your silence exposed them. Because authenticity doesn't need volume, it carries its own frequency. Even in your quietest seasons, chosen ones, your presence spoke louder than their accusations. The stillness of your refusal was more powerful than their loudest lies. So never doubt the strength of that choice. Silence was not surrender. Silence was not weakness. Silence was survival, strategy, and strength rolled into one. It was your way of reclaiming control over your story. Every moment you stayed quiet, you took the pen out of their hands and reminded them, you will no longer be written into scripts that diminish you. And now, as people look closer, they finally see the truth. You weren't the problem. You were the revelation, and your silence, oh chosen ones, was the loudest revelation of all. Number 9. Freedom that revealed their fragile core. Freedom exposed their fragility. The chains they tried to wrap around you weren't proof of their strength, they were proof of their fear. Chosen ones, let's lay this bare. True strength never flinches in the presence of another person's freedom. Real confidence doesn't tremble when someone else stands tall. Genuine power celebrates equality because it isn't threatened by it. But what you were dealing with was never strength. It was fear dressed up as authority, insecurity masked as control. And the moment you stepped into your freedom, the mask slipped, and everyone could see just how fragile they really were. Think about it. If their power had been real, your independence would not have rattled them. If their foundation was solid, your boundaries would not have shaken it. If their confidence was authentic, your refusal to bow would not have sent them spiraling. But instead, every time you said no, every time you lived without asking permission, every time you moved in alignment with your own truth, they cracked. Why? Because they were never built to stand beside equals. They only knew how to dominate, how to tower over, how to inflate themselves by pressing others down. And when you stopped being the person they could press down, their entire illusion of power began to disintegrate. Their authority wasn't something earned. It wasn't something born from wisdom, integrity, or real respect. It was borrowed from your obedience, from your silence, from your willingness to bend. Their so-called confidence was nothing more than a reflection of how much control they could squeeze out of you. And when you refused to hand it over, when you tore the script apart and started living outside their rules, they had to face the truth they worked their whole lives to bury. Without domination, they were empty. Chosen ones, doesn't it sting them now that your freedom turned into the mirror they couldn't escape? Every choice you made without asking for their approval was a reminder that they never really held power. Every step you took outside their grip reflected back their weakness. You weren't just saying no, you were exposing the hollow systems they had built to make themselves look strong. Your very existence without their control was like a spotlight shining directly on their insecurities. Ask yourself, why did they fight so hard to cage you? Why did they spend endless energy trying to dictate your choices, limit your expression, confine your voice? It wasn't because your independence hurt them. It was because your independence revealed them. Your refusal to be controlled showed everyone else that their dominance wasn't real. It was fragile scaffolding, a stage set propped up by manipulation and fear. The moment you stepped off that stage, the set collapsed. And here's the part they'll never admit. Their collapse wasn't because you fought them. It wasn't because you waged war or shouted louder. It was because you simply refused to live as they demanded. That's it. That's what broke them. You didn't swing a sword. You just walked away with your integrity intact. You didn't launch an attack. You lived free. And that was enough to make their whole world tremble. Let's make this crystal clear. Control is never proof of strength. Submission is never proof of weakness. Real power thrives beside other strong people. It doesn't need obedience to feel secure. It doesn't demand silence to feel respected. It celebrates freedom because it has nothing to hide. But what you dealt with couldn't survive in the presence of your independence. And that, chosen ones, is why they came for you so viciously. Not because you were the problem, but because you were the evidence. Evidence that their so-called strength was nothing more than dependency on other people's compliance. Every attempt they made to suppress you, every threat they threw, every manipulation they tried, all of it failed because freedom cannot be caged. It cannot be erased by someone else's fear. And with every failed attempt, the truth grew louder. They weren't strong, they were fragile. They weren't dominant, they were desperate. And you, by simply living free, exposed them for what they always were. So understand this, chosen ones. Their collapse wasn't your destruction, it was their revelation. They saw in you the one thing they could never achieve for themselves: self-respect, authenticity, and independence. And that revelation didn't just bruise their ego, it shattered the illusion they had built so tightly around their identity. That's why they tried to break you, because your freedom was living proof that their control had no weight, no permanence, no real power. And now the world is finally seeing it too. They're finally seeing you weren't the problem, they just couldn't control you. And the more you continue to stand free, the more their fragility will be exposed. And chosen ones, as we reach the end of this truth, let it settle in. They're finally seeing you weren't the problem. They just couldn't control you. Their collapse was never about your weakness. It was about your strength shining too bright to be contained. If this resonated with you, show your power by hitting like, smashing that subscribe button, and dropping the number 77 in the comments so I know you're walking in your freedom. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, because the truth always spreads when chosen ones stand tall.